are these other realities, and that these beings sometimes are in that realm. They're not fully in the physical realm. Sometimes they can come into the physical realm, but it takes a lot of energy and effort sometimes to fully manifest into the physicality of, what we would think of as material realm. And so sometimes it's easier or better for them to stay in this energetic state and bring us into that energetic state, through our subtle bodies. And so I think, and this is part of what makes talking about and understanding what's happening so confusing, because we have this very strong view of a physical world, and that's the only world there is.
Yeah.
I think part of what's helpful when you start realizing this kind of larger esoteric cosmology, where these other realms and dimensions are around and available, and how they operate and how beings in them use them, and how those realms interface with this realm. I think you're right that a lot of experiences are occurring in the subtle realms or in this liminal space, this imaginal realm. It doesn't mean it's happening in the mind, because sometimes it can be, absolutely. I mean, and fantasy and delusion is mixed in with a lot of this, right? But in the authentic cases, the person's basically just going into that realm with their subtle body, whereas their physical body remains in this realm. And then they're in that body and walking around, interacting with these beings. And that sometimes the implants are even energetic implants into that subtle body. So they're not even like physical in the way that we would think of physicality. And then when that subtle body goes back and integrates with the physical body, they have an implant, but it's not necessarily a physical implant that you would find under a microscope. It might be like kind of a technology that's created out of etheric matter that only can be seen and experienced and in that frequency.
Real implants you've seen?
Well, I haven't seen, but I know there's been a lot of good research on real implants, physical implants. But I also know that some implants are not physical in that sense, but are like energetic.
Right. And somehow they can manifest from whatever other thing our brain is constructing when we're asleep or in some other state into a physical state.
Yeah.
What sort of evidence is there, like physical evidence is there of experiencers having implants?
You can feel them sometimes under the skin. They've been x-rayed. They've been surgically removed. They're often, very tiny, like Roger Lear, Dr. Lear, studied a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Whitley Strieber talks about how the implant in his ear moved around and then, so he can feel it. And, so there's, sometimes there's scars, sometimes there's scoop marks, that appear overnight. And it's kind of like, I didn't have that yesterday. And now all of a sudden I have a scoop mark of a wound that would have taken 2 weeks generally to heal, but it's like it's there overnight. So there can be body marks. So there's a lot of different kinds of circumstantial and suggestive evidence. And there's been physical implants removed. I think there's at least 20 that have been documented and studied.
And what did they determine those things were when they were removed?
Yeah, and this is part of what's interesting with the phenomena. It's like often when they've been removed, the studies have been inconclusive, or it's been like organic matter, or just typical metals that you find on this planet.
Yeah.
Right. And so then that becomes a basis from which to dismiss it.
Right.
And maybe that's justified, but there's enough other elements to the story that make you should maybe be thoughtful about dismissing it. Because sure, we don't understand it, but given all the other bits, like it seems like maybe something's going on.
We have been visited by extraterrestrials potentially since the very beginning of time. And so while they've been here, what have they been doing? Well, one of the things that people out there believe is that potentially some of these alien races may be here to experiment on humans. And why would they do that, you might ask? Well, maybe they're interested in how our DNA works. I mean, we are very complex beings. The fact that sort of, you start from this tiny little seed of a being to grow into this full-blown, very complex organism is truly amazing. And maybe there's something special about humans that other alien species would be interested in, whether it's learning about us or just sort of observing us and our behaviors. So in the past, we've talked about aliens before. We've talked about alien abductions before. And we've briefly talked about aliens experimenting on humans through some of these abduction stories. Well, today we're going to be talking about an individual named Roger Leir.
Absolutely correct. People have been looking for physical evidence for years. You know, where's the Holy Grail? Is it a piece of the Roswell craft or a piece of something else? Well, as you mentioned, this is a physical object which you can not only hold in your hand, but you can dissect in many different ways, both biologically and metallurgically, and you can come up with some factual information. So we look at these things, and as any scientific effort would do, you look at them from the outside in. So we look at them macroscopically, you know, what do they look like? 7 are little metallic rods that are about maybe 6 millimeters in length and about the thickness of a pencil lead, and they're covered with this very strange gray sort of biological coating that you can't cut through with a surgical blade.
Wow.
And then come to find out that this the surrounding tissue shows no rejection or inflammatory reaction to the object. Well, that's, as far as we know, as medical people, is virtually impossible.
And he was a doctor who actually claimed to remove alien implants from some of his patients. So he believes that aliens abducted these individuals, or just, you know, while they're sleeping, implanted these different types of devices or pieces of what look like just everyday metals or something we're not even sure where it came from, potentially, for whatever reason. And so these patients visited Roger Leir, and he really became sort of the expert on alien implants. I don't know about you, but the idea that while you're sleeping, potentially an alien might have either abducted you and then just erased your memory, or while you were sleeping, probed you, inserted something into your body in order to track you, collect data on you, is kind of a terrifying thing to wrap your head around. It
Definitely.
really is. Because it's very possible that it could be happening, and there's a lot of people out there that have reported waking up with very bizarre injuries that they're like, how the hell did I get these scratches or these marks? Or, you know, they straight up are like, there's this thing under my skin, I can see it, but there's no way that I did this to myself. There's nothing I would have came in contact that would have even looked like that now ended up embedded into my body. There's actually a decent amount of evidence for some type of extraterrestrial species, or perhaps artificial species, that could be working in conjunction with the government, you know, top secret programs, things like that, where they are doing DNA sort of analysis on human beings, and they're trying to reverse engineer, maybe to create some sort of hybrid species of like human alien, or maybe trying to clone. I mean, there's so many possibilities here, but the fact that there's actually a substantial amount of evidence to suggest this, that there are extraterrestrials that perhaps are testing on us or implanting things in our bodies, is kind of terrifying. The fact that the UFO subject continues to, you know, rear its head here time and time again is very interesting, but it seems like people still, for the most part, don't really care. Like, they're still like, oh, you know, that's cool that there's UFOs, but like, they're not actually thinking about, well, what does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean that we're not alone, that there are some other type of species here on the planet other than human beings that's intelligent, that has technology that far surpasses what we have right now? I mean, I think that's something we all have to really like consider and prepare for, because it could be any day now that, you know, we find out for sure, you know, the alien lands on the White House lawn,
Right.
and all of a sudden we're seeing these beings that don't look like us, or maybe they do look like us, and they're like, yeah, we're from Andromeda Galaxy.
Yeah,
We just got
right.
here. Or, you know, who knows how they'll communicate. Maybe it'll be telepathic, most likely. I mean, there's people that for years and years and years have claimed to have been abducted, have claimed to have stuff implanted into them. So these are all topics that I find super interesting, and hopefully you do too. And that's why we are going to be uncovering what Dr. Leir has found in his career when it comes to alien implant victims. Roger was born on March 20th, 1935 in San Francisco, California. And he attended the University of Southern California and graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1961. In 1964, he received his doctorate in pediatric surgery. He continued his medical career as a foot surgeon and often came across patients seeking relief in their legs or feet. And along the way, his interest in extraterrestrial life began to unfold. As he looked at the stars, he knew that each one would be its own sun or planet, and he wondered about the possibility of intelligent life existing in those other solar systems. Knowing he would risk his reputation, Roger became fascinated with the idea of possible alien experimentation on humans. And not long after becoming a foot surgeon, he joined a local chapter at the Mutual UFO Network known as MUFON, but kept his interests separate from his professional work. And it wasn't until the 1990s when his interest in alien life crossed over to his professional career. Extraterrestrial theories surged in the 90s with the input from Bob Lazar. His theories on alien technology involved things like alien spacecraft, antimatter reactors, and synthetic chemical elements. Bob Lazar placed Area 51 under the spotlight when he claimed it to be a research facility where the government kept secrets of alien technology. And although his claims didn't hold much water to the masses, organizations like MUFON gained interest in discovering alien technology. UFOs, abductions, and probings became much more mainstream topics. And during this time of peak interest, Dr. Roger Leir became absorbed in the concept of what he called non-terrestrial experimentation on man, or more specifically, alien implants. And so began his search for alien abductees. Within the network of other ufologists, Roger came across a man named Daryl Sims. He was a certified hypnotherapist and a member of the Houston chapter of MUFON. And after his son was abducted, when he was 5 years old, Daryl Sims began offering counseling sessions to other abductees free of charge. Knowing the trauma his son had gone through, Daryl was willing to help any other victims of alien abductions. And over the years, he built a long list of clientele. And when Roger made contact with Daryl, he knew there would be a large pool of abductees to pick from. Daryl suggested that those who thought they were probed should get x-rays to confirm if they had implants, and those who ended up having a foreign object inside of them were directed to Roger. Even though he was a podiatrist and his professional focus was on the feet, he accepted patients who had foreign objects anywhere in the body. Both Dr. Leir and Daryl Sims were in agreement about the implants, and they both searched for the hard scientific evidence that could prove the existence of non-terrestrial life. And not only that, but non-terrestrial life that actively observed or manipulated humans. This was the evidence that Roger would call the smoking gun. Soon, their first two abductees volunteered for surgery. Each had an X-ray examination which showed one patient having an object in their big toe and the other having an object in between their thumb and index finger. On August 19, 1995, both patients were scheduled for surgery. Along with the X-rays, Roger used ultrasound to confirm where the objects were. And most of the time they were a piece of metal no bigger than a BB pellet. Sometimes they were as small as a pinhead. So these surgeries needed to be done in incredible accuracy. Roger cut through the skin closest to where the foreign object was planted with a small surgical knife. Then he used surgical forceps. This tool looked like scissors, but instead of blades, they had small pinchers at the end. He used this tool to find and remove the object, and if he was close, he could feel the piece of metal right away. And depending on how long the piece of metal had been inside the person, sometimes he had to dig through a bit of tissue so he could find it. The objects were so small sometimes that they were tough to find, but by the end of the day, Roger had successfully removed the two metal objects inside the abductees. He also kept a bit of the human tissue that surrounded the object to test how it interacted with the body. But now that Roger had his first two samples, his plan was to run them through a series of tests to determine what they were made of. Roger believed these tests would be their pathway to proof, but it would also be their biggest setback. The tests they wanted to conduct on foreign objects were extremely expensive, plus there were a lot of tests to be done. In addition to the x-rays and surgeries, Roger also wanted pathology tissue evaluations from two independent pathologists. They would study the human tissue just outside of the object to see how it reacted to it. Then he wanted tests done to see if any electromagnetic activity came from the object itself. And on top of all that, he wanted to test the metal and see what it was made of. All of these tests took years to finish, and the cost quickly added up. So Roger and Daryl created a nonprofit organization to continue their research. It was called the Fund for Interactive Research in Space Technology. But before they started the organization, Roger was very worried about his reputation as a doctor. The subjects of UFOs and aliens were taboo in the realm of science and research, and he considered using an alias until he could confirm the implants were actually non-terrestrial material. But in the end, he knew that would just take way too long. And if they wanted to continue their studies, Roger knew he had to start making some noise and drawing attention to their work if they were ever going to get enough funding. So he made his name public and told the UFO community what they had been working on. He was confident that the tests would reveal something non-terrestrial. And after years of research, their tests on one of the objects finally came back. According to Roger and Daryl, the foreign object they had extracted from their patient revealed quite a lot. The pathology test showed that the metal object was coated in a membrane of biological tissue, and they suspected that the purpose of the membrane was so the patient's body wouldn't detect it has a foreign object. And all along the membrane were tiny nerve fibers sticking out, and Daryl claimed that these fibers were connected to larger fibers in the patient's body. As for the tests of the metal itself, Roger claimed that some of the elements within the object were meteoric. It consisted of 11 different elements, and Roger concluded that the object was non-terrestrial. Before they extracted the object, he also used a radio frequency meter to see if the object transmitted anything. They claimed to have picked up a few small radio waves, suggesting that the object might have been transmitting some sort of information. After releasing their findings to the public, Dr. Lear and Daryl Sims were thrown into stardom. The UFO community became obsessed with their discoveries, and Roger became the frontrunner in the search of physical evidence that supported the existence of alien intelligence. Their discoveries had gone mainstream. Dr. Lear soon made his way to TV shows and radio interviews. Coast to Coast AM, a national late-night radio talk show, welcomed Roger several times. From then on, his work came under the media spotlight. But with all this fame, backlash quickly formed. Skeptics in the scientific community accused Roger and Daryl of exaggerating, misinterpreting, or lying about the results. Many of their biggest critics claimed that the objects were most likely fragments from everyday objects. The patients likely stepped on a metal object, or had a minor carpentry accident that they barely remembered. And the radio transmissions that Dr. Lear had detected were just background frequencies from nearby phones, TVs, or radios. And in the end, their findings weren't enough to convince anyone outside of the UFO community. It hadn't been the clear-cut smoking gun that Roger was looking for. But despite the criticism, Roger kept going with his work. And throughout the course of his work, Roger worked on a total of 17 abductee patients, and he believed 16 of them had been implanted with alien technology. Although these tiny metal fragments were challenging to understand, Roger thought the implants were some sort of nanotechnology. As far as Roger could tell, this technology was far beyond our understanding, and it was way more advanced than anything we've created on Earth. And as for their purpose, he believed the extraterrestrials' goal was to collect data from abductees. He thought the implants were somehow connected to an extraterrestrial supercomputer, and that the abductees were also connected somehow. He suspected the aliens were interested in traversing space and time, or maybe they wanted a way to dimensionally shift into our reality. He also believed the aliens were especially interested in human sperm, and Roger thought that they wanted to collect samples in hopes of doing something genetic. But Dr. Lear could only speculate. Anything more was a mystery.
Well, you're
As for each individual implant, none of them looked similar. Each was unique to their specific patient. Some looked like they had properties similar to a crystal, and others looked like tiny metal beads. Some even had mysterious abilities. During his operation on patient 15, the abductee believed he had an implant in his toe. He said he woke up one day and noticed blood spots on his bed sheets, and he suffered extreme pain in a specific area in his toe. So he went to see Dr. Lear, and after an examination, he found a metal object in the man's finger, even though the pain had been in his toe. The man had no recollection of ever being wounded on his hand. And after further examination, Roger discovered that the object was a tiny piece of metal, and there was no trace of any wound. Roger recommended his patient have surgery to remove the piece of metal, and it wasn't until a follow-up visit when the patient finally told Roger about being an abductee. He had told him about multiple abduction experiences, and he even claimed that his wife and children were also abducted at one point. He said the aliens had followed him around for most of his life, and he feared they had implanted something inside of him. He quickly agreed to have surgery, though, and Roger always used an X-ray during the operation that produced a live image of the object during extraction. After he had made his first cut and began searching for the tiny piece of metal, Roger experienced something that he had never seen before in any of his patients. Before he could grab the object, he saw that the piece of metal broke into several different parts on the X-ray feed. He then had to extract each tiny fragment separately. And after removing each piece, he placed the metal on a sanitary cloth and coated each piece with a preservative. As he went to remove the last one, it completely disappeared. He couldn't see it in the patient's finger, and he couldn't see it on the X-ray. He searched for a very long time, but in the end, he gave up. The last tiny piece of metal was lost. He took the parts he had successfully removed and put them into a container. And 3 days later, when he wanted to continue his research on the pieces of metal, he opened up the container and noticed that all the separate fragments had actually come together in a single file line. Out of his own curiosity, he closed the lid and shook the container so that the pieces separated again, and then set it on the table for 15 minutes. And again, he opened the container and noticed that all of the pieces had come together. There was some sort of magnetic force at work between the pieces. Several more times he shook the container, and every time the samples came back together. Roger even took video footage of this strange phenomenon. And in the end, he concluded that the pieces of metal had a magnetic memory between them. This was the only time Roger had ever seen anything like this before.
You what, mate?